Anyway, good morning, everyone. It's August 23rd, 2020. This is the Faith and Function class, and this class is being recorded. So don't say anything that you wouldn't say in church or Sunday school anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome, especially after the most trying spring and summer that we can remember in at least 50 years that we have experienced as individuals, as families, as congregations, as community, as a nation, as a world. And it's good to, in every way that we possibly can be, to be together again. Technology in this class has changed dramatically over the years. Just a few years ago, we started using Facebook Live in order to put our class out there. And that was all because a friend of Matt Matthews said, geez, I wish I could see the class. So he said, okay, we will. And then when we moved to the renovated Jones building, we went live stream. And now, of course, we're here in Zoom. The progress, a major progress of that is that we now have the ability to have back and forth in a way that we have not had before at a distance. I can't wait till next year or the next technology phase when holograms are the way we use our class presentations. That's going to be pretty exciting. Today, we are most pleased to have with us the Reverend Dr. Kendra Hotz, who not only is an associate professor of religious studies at Rhodes, but even more importantly to us is a very special friend, counselor, and to many of us, and a true leader in our spiritual journey, individually and collectively over the years. And it's a great way to start off the year. We have a very good lineup, as we always try to do for this fall. Patrick Gray, the chair of the Religious Studies Department at Rhodes, will be with us in October. And Steve McKenzie as well from Rhodes, and we'll end with Jim McAllister, who is our member of our class and special friend. And want to point out a couple of things that are also going on at Idlewild, which you may be interested in. At the same time, but also repeated on Wednesday, is a 10-week anti-racism class called Looking Inward, Moving Forward, an Anti-Racism Journey. I commend you to join that. You can, because of the way that it's structured, you can do both. You can listen to and watch a recording of one of the classes, ours or the other one. So there is no real conflict there. Also, Ann Bradley Thomas has a podcast on Praying the Psalms, which she has done beautifully and continues to do so, and we're blessed with that. This morning, we are going to spend some special time, as much time as you would like, to share your joys, your concerns, our joys, our concerns. Kendra's going to lead that, and when we're exhausted, either by speaking up, which you just unmute yourself, or by adding to the chat room, Kendra will lead us in a prayer before she begins her series, the Bible and a City. So, Kendra, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rick. I am so thrilled to be back with this group. I thought for certain that I would be back with you in person last spring when we set up this series, but it is delightful to see your faces, or at least your names, even if you are sort of postage stamp sized. Um, I think that we can't simply rush into Sunday school this new year without acknowledging this just enormous loss that we've all experienced with the death of Steve Montgomery. And so let's just take some time, all of your joys, all of your concerns, but also I was just thinking everybody has a Steve story. You know, everybody's got something. And I thought we might just take a bit of time to share. And you can do that by unmuting yourself and sharing, or you can open up the chat and type a little something there. While you're gathering your thoughts, I'll share mine. I was thinking, like, what is it that, like, what is the story I remember about Steve that sort of epitomizes for me who he is? And I was remembering one Maundy Thursday, I had preached a More Than a Meal style sermon, and I was drawing on some funny, not funny, some imagery from Jesus Christ Superstar, which is not the most reverent thing to do on a Maundy Thursday, which is supposed to be, you know, a fairly somber occasion. But you know, Steve had this irrepressible delight, this kind of inability to contain his sheer joy, even on those somber occasions. And so we were standing in the hallway outside of the sanctuary after worship, and he began telling me about a time, I think it was in college, when he had been in a musical production of Jesus Christ Superstar. He had been part of the chorus line, and he sang a little bit of What's the Buzz while doing a little shuffle dance. So what's the buzz? Tell me what's happening. Well, he's dancing all around right outside of the sanctuary on Maundy Thursday. And when I think about Steve Montgomery, I think about this kind of silliness, right? A kind of reverent silliness. And I mean that in the most loving possible way. So I'm curious, what are you thinking? What are you remembering?
Well, you could.
Yeah,
Now speak.
it's Claire. Okay.
Go
Okay,
ahead, Claire.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Mine is just a little general comment. I made copies of the bulletin for years, which meant I was in Carol Good's office a lot. Of course, she was Steve's secretary. So he was in and out of her office while I was there, which was so much fun. He always had something cheerful to say, but I was amazed at how thin he was because I'd only seen him in black robes for, months and months. He was always very well dressed, I'll tell you that. Casual, but good looking clothes. And I don't think he was ever in a bad mood. Some of us have bad days, but Steve didn't share them with us. He was terrific. That's all. Yeah.
If I could say something, my memory of Steve is that I was a regular at the 8:30 service. And when my mother died, she died under kind of difficult circumstances in that she had a fall and declined very quickly and then made a decision to stop eating and died a week later. And I remember how important it was for me, for my friends at the 8:30 service to know that. And I called Steve and expected it to go to voicemail. This was the morning after she died, a Sunday morning, about 10 after 8. And he picked up the phone. And of course, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, whoa, wait a second, worship is in 20 minutes. But he still stopped to talk and listen. And it was extremely important to me. And then when his own mother was dying, and after the worship service, he left to go to Atlanta and just stopped briefly in the lobby. And I wanted to comfort him in the same way. But I don't think he could receive the comfort. And later when he came to the session meeting, a month or so after his mother had died, he told a funny story about her having been comatose and within a few days of her death. And he stopped in the hospital room where his brother had been holding vigil and, watching a football game on the television with the sound out. And as I say, she appeared to be comatose. And he asked his brother Jim what the score was, and then turned to his mother, and with the hand on her bed, she had made the Longhorn sign. So he was able to tell that poignant story, but when people tried to comfort him, or after the meeting, he wasn't able to receive it. I don't think I was the only one who noticed that. And so one of the things that he was a wonderful, joyful person. And I hope he had the support of many people. I hope he felt the support of many people. I know he certainly did with Micah. But it's a tough job being a minister. And I have really been grateful for Anne. I was grateful at the way she put the thoughts and prayers of the congregation into words. I was so moved by the memorial service and everything that our staff had to say, everything that everyone had to say, for that matter. And we had such a gift. And, I hope, especially with the words of John Lewis so fresh in my mind, I really hope there is a commitment to take action in a different way, to make his life really resound, because we were very fortunate.
Kendra, Paige Williamson. I have. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. He liked to tell the story of my daughter, Mary, who happened to have been on the search committee. A week after he gets to Idlewild, settles in the desk, Mary marches in his office and says, "I'm leaving Idlewild." And Steve, startled, says, "Oh my goodness, why?" And she says, "I'm going to Temple Israel." And he said, "I'm so glad. I was afraid it was second pres." Anyway, he told that story over and over.
At my husband's funeral, when he was just stood up to give the eulogy and just started it, the lights flickered and he just looked and said, like, okay, he's here. And everyone laughed, but it really made a difference. And not all ministers would have the guts to do that.
Okay, let's keep these stories before us, not just of Steve, but of all the great saints who have gone before us. I think it's important to remember and to tell the stories. These are the stories that make us who we are. So this won't be our last opportunity to share these stories. Let's come into prayer together. God, you spark the creation of the stars and bear silent witness to their fiery life cycle. You observed the patient earthworm aerating the soil on its slow journey home. And you call your human creatures into life and purpose. We remember before you our pastor and friend, Steve Montgomery. He was a witness to our hope and struggle, a companion in our grief and delight. We remember before you all those who have come before us, whose stories have gotten woven into our stories, who have made us who we are. We pray that you keep their memories and their stories lively in our minds and hearts, that you kindle us to be courageous enough to keep that story going, to tell it well, to live it out, to find the space in our hearts for compassion, for righteous anger where it is needed, for the tender moments where they are wanted, and for the silliness, the delight, the simple observation of the good things in the world that make us pause and take our breath away. In the midst of all the evil and suffering and injustice, still we have that moment where we see the kernel of good and know that you beckon us toward a better story. Receive now into your presence our beloved friend. Ask him when you see him for a quick shuffle dance and a song. It'll give you a laugh. Amen. I think one thing pastors learn to do that I have not mastered is how to contain their own emotions. What I want to do in this week and the 5 weeks to follow is think about the Bible as an extended meditation on urban life. And we're going to be looking both at texts in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament to think about how the Bible is trying to make sense of why we live the way we do. The time in which the Bible was written was a time when people were already living in cities. They were already experiencing population density. They were already building walls and anticipating massive warfare. Violence has always been a part of human society for as long as we have been a species. But violence on the scale that we experience after the agricultural revolution, after the building of cities, is something that the human species had not seen before. The work that it takes to coordinate efforts for the massive scale of life in urban contexts also magnifies all of our vices, but also all of our virtues. We achieve something extraordinary when we live together, but we also magnify our worst tendencies. And the Bible is this long reflection on how human life makes sense, given that we live the way we do, that we worship different gods, that we have different cultures, that we speak different languages, and that we hold different values. And when we are smooshed together in urban contexts, we have to come to terms with all of that in a way that's different from what they are nostalgically remembering as the days when they lived as nomads following the herds. And so there's this real ambivalence about city life in the Bible, and that's what we're going to spend our time thinking about. Today, we're going to do that by tracing out some key themes in the primeval narrative that goes from Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 11. And we are going to pull out some elements of the J narrative. So you will remember that J, the Yahwistic author, this is the author who primarily calls God Yahweh. In your English language Bibles, that'll be the word Lord, L-O-R-D, in all capital letters. And this is the author who is probably, it's really not an author, it's really kind of a school of thought, but let's say the J author, probably living around the time of the United Monarchy. And the J author isn't inventing new stories. What J is doing is gathering up the stories that people have been telling for a really long time and framing them in a new way and putting them in a certain order. And here's the hard thing to get. J is not putting those stories in the order that we find them in our Bibles. A later editor try to imagine all the stories that your family tells. And some of them might be about Aunt Irma from the 1920s, and some of them might be from your little sister in the 1980s, and others might be from all over. And when you try to explain to somebody who your family is, you don't necessarily put those stories in the order in which they happened, right? You break them up, you intersperse them, you tell those stories in a different kind of order. The J author is taking stories and stringing them together like pearls on a strand in order to create something. A later author breaks up the strand, takes the pearls, and puts them in a different order. So we have the narrative order of that later author, whom we would associate with the priestly author, and then even a later redactor than that. what we're going to try to do today is reconstruct what Jay was doing, and we're going to look at 4 stories. So first I have to tell you that none of this is my own material. You probably all remember by now that I'm not by training a biblical scholar. So you've got real biblical scholars coming next. Patrick Gray, Steve McKenzie, I've forgotten who your 3rd visitor is, but you know, these are kind of first order biblical scholars. I'm a hack. So what we're going to do is borrow what we can learn. And I'm using this author for any of you who are curious. This is Mark McIntyre. This is a brand new book. I'll put it in the chat here in a minute. Not Scattered or Confused, and Rethinking the Urban World of the Hebrew Bible. I will tell you that this is a fairly dense scholarly book. It does not presuppose that you know Hebrew, so it's not scholarly in that sense, but it's not also written in a way that is designed for your typical Sunday school class. You are not your typical Sunday school class, though, so I feel reasonably confident that the folk in this class would be able to read this and make heads or tails of it. Just be aware, it would be a little bit slower going than things I've recommended to you in the past. Okay, so what we're going to do is string together, following the lead of Mark McIntyre. I'm going to, do a screen share here. We're going to string together some texts. Okay, so you should be seeing the story of Cain from Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, and then Cain's sons, Genesis 4, verses 17 through 24. Now, when I share my screen, I cannot see you very well, and I'm even having trouble seeing the chat. Let me see if I can pull that up. So I'll try to be able to see the chat if you want to pipe in and share things here. I have not yet got used to teaching using Zoom with a big group, and there are 30 of us here. So if you need to interrupt me to jump in and say something, I really want you to do that. But I'm unlikely to notice you waving your hand around because my screen is monopolized by this whiteboard. So I'm going to ask you to pop into the chat and share what's on your mind as we're going. All right, so has everybody had time? Are you there at Genesis chapter 4? All right, now, you know the story well. We've gone over it multiple times before. This is the story of Cain and Abel, and we are living outside of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve have gotten us expelled from that because they wanted to know the difference between good and evil. And so here we are, beginning of chapter 4. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore a son, Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. So first thing you're going to want to know is that Cain is a triumphant name, and Abel is not. Abel means something that's vain or empty. So right at the beginning, we know, things are not going to go well for Abel. But we also jump right from the fact that they are born to the fact that they have these jobs. This is a J narrative, by the way. You can tell because it says, the Lord. P doesn't use that name yet, not until Exodus chapter 6, I think. So we jump right to the fact that they have these particular jobs. And what that should tell you is that this is going to be a story about these jobs. You're also going to want to know that the people telling this story are associated with a history of people who were nomads, right? The Jay telling this story is thinking about the fact that by ancestry, the people of Israel were keepers of sheep. Cain is a tiller of the ground. Tillers of the ground stayed in one place and built cities. So they were the ones who settled. We've got to think about this as a conflict between settlers and nomads. And you should know that the people recording this story would be cheering for the nomad. In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. Uh-oh, my screen just stopped sharing. Let me.
We can still see it, or I can still see it.
Okay. For some reason, I couldn't. Okay, I'll just make sure I move it often enough that that doesn't happen. So we sort of imagine, I think, when we read this, that Cain and Abel brought a sacrifice to a temple. But if you keep reading, it says that the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. And we aren't told why that's the case. We aren't told why God likes one and not the other. But it's very often the case that when the Bible uses this language, the term here is sort of like the Lord looked upon Abel with favor and didn't look upon Cain with favor. That very often means that one person succeeded and another person didn't. So, you know, imagine that I am trying to make a good loaf of whole wheat sourdough sandwich bread. I think like about half of America, I have I've kind of acquired this obsession with sourdough during the pandemic. And I'm trying to make a good loaf of whole wheat sourdough sandwich bread, and so is a friend. And hers rises beautifully. It's got a perfect crust, a lovely open crumb, and mine is as dense as a brick. We might say, if we were sort of biblically minded, that the Lord looked favorably on her sourdough, but not on mine, right? So it's possible that this just means that Abel had good luck with his flocks and Cain didn't. Cain gets angry and kills his brother Abel. Verse 8, Cain said to Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. And then God asks, "Where is your brother?" And ultimately he curses Cain. So notice that the first narrative of sin in the Bible, this is the first place where the word sin is used in the Bible. It's not used when Eve eats that fruit. The first use of sin in the Bible is Cain, who is a settler, and the very next thing he's going to do is build a city. The first sin is that a settler kills a nomad. What we're setting up here is a potential thread where what's happening is that nomadic life is threatened by urban life. So our very first instance of sin is a settler killing a nomad. God punishes Cain and tells him that you will be a wanderer on the ground and that farming will be hard for you. That's the same curse that the man and the woman received, that they would be expelled from the garden and that farming would be hard. Cain says, "Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me will kill me." So there's this anticipation of increased violence. In verse 16, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Verse 17, this is the turning point. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, Enoch, and he built a city and named it Enoch after his son. All right, so look what happens in quick succession. We're expelled from the garden. The settler kills the nomad. The settler goes on to build a city and name it after his son. And then his grandsons or great-grandsons or whatever do the following. Come with me down to verse 20. Adah bore Jabal, who was the ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock. Nomads. We need nomads again because Abel is dead. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the ancestor of all who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. So what we're getting from Cain's descendants are cultural innovators who are building up the necessary components of civilization. You need artistry, you need agriculture, and you need tool making. Specifically, we are leaving behind the Stone Age and entering into the age of different kinds of metal, bronze and iron. Okay, so we have this really compressed history of humankind moving toward urban life. All right, that's where we are with Cain and Cain's sons. And you see that we've already kind of set up what we need for civilization and what we need for urban life. All right, next piece of the kind of J narrative is this really strange account in chapter 6. Let me get the exact phrasing here. This is chapter 6, 1 through 4. And this is this weird language about the sons of God and the Nephilim. And by the way, the sons of God and the Nephilim are not actually the same group. So people began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the sons of God see that the daughters of women are, that the daughters are fair, and they take them for wives, and they have children whom God responds to by saying, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years." Okay, I wish we were in person because I find myself wanting to ask you, what does that tell you about the children born to the sons of God and human women? I'm just curious. Anybody want to pop in real quick? There's something special about those children that God's concerned about. Can you tell what it is?
I assume it's something along the lines of them living for a really long time, and maybe this is related to all these super long lifespans in Genesis.
Yeah. So what you hear is the sons of God are having children with human women, and apparently their children are living a really long time. And so God has decided to limit their lifespan, and they are limited to 120 years. So God has decided that their lifespan will be limited. Next, we have the Nephilim who are on the earth. And when the sons of God went into the daughters of human who bore children, these were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. So when it says of renown, a more literal translation of that would be something like men of a name. They made a name for themselves. So look what we're doing here. We're moving from, why is my civilization, to a limitation on the lifespan, to this desire for leaving a mark on the earth, this desire to be renowned, to make a name for oneself. All right. Then we get interrupted by a story of the flood, which when you read Genesis carefully, it doesn't really make sense why the flood happens right when it did. It looks like an interruption of something else that was going on. The way you can tell that is that we're told these sons of Cain develop all of these amazing cultural innovations, and then the flood happens and all of that should have gotten wiped out. What that might tell us is that originally the flood was a separate story and an editor decided to insert it right there. If we skipped the flood, narratively, it actually makes sense that the next thing that happens is chapter 10, where we get the birth of the 3 sons of Noah. We get Ham, who is the father of city dwellers, Shem, who is the father of the Semitic people, who are nomads, and Jephthah, I've probably misspelled his name, Japheth, yes I have. See? Who is the father of the coastal people, fishers. So we've got three different kinds of civilization coming at us. We've got city dwellers, Semitic nomads, and coastal people. The big conflict that's going to happen throughout the Hebrew Bible is between this group, the ancestors of the Israelites, and on the one hand, imperial powers associated with Ham, and on the other hand, the Philistines, who are associated with the coastal people. So we're going to follow Ham next. Take a look at chapter 10, starting around verse 6. The descendants of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. The descendants of Cush, I'm going to skip for a while. Cush, verse 8, became the father of Nimrod. Now, that is a great biblical name. Why do people not name their children Nimrod? Nimrod was the first on the earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. What does Nimrod build? He stops being a hunter-gatherer, a warrior and a hunter, and he becomes something else. What does he become?
He builds these big Babylonian cities.
Yeah. He's a builder of imperial cities. Look at that list of the cities he builds. So you know about Nineveh, right? Do you know where Nineveh is? Do you happen to remember? Who goes to Nineveh?
Jonah.
Who?
Jonah.
Thank you. Yes, Jonah. I was just getting ready to say Daniel is carrying the weight of participation here. And I am going to apologize for this means of participation. It's really strange when I can't see you. Okay, yeah, Jonah goes to Nineveh, and you remember that Nineveh is the capital of the enemy empire, right? That's the Assyrian Empire. Rehoboth, that is a Mesopotamian city. Let's see where I left over. Babel, you know what's going to happen in Babel, right? Akkad, that's Acadia. What we're doing here is looking at all of the great cities associated with the imperial powers that will later dominate Israel. So Ham, who is cursed, look at the cursing. Cain is cursed because he killed Abel. Ham is cursed because he saw his dad naked, right? You remember that story about Noah? That's a weird story. What we've got here is the line of those who are cursed and wiped out, and their descendant Nimrod becomes this builder of cities. And if you will take a look at the particular city that Nimrod builds, now we're going to go to chapter 11 and talk about Babel. All right, Nimrod starts his life as a Cushite. Cush is associated with Africa, and he's a hunter. So he starts his life as an African hunter, and he ends his life as a builder of imperial cities in Mesopotamia. Okay, let's see where this is going to take us. Come ahead to chapter 11. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. Take a look at Genesis chapter 11. This is the story of Babel. So this is kind of like the first really big city that we spend any time in the Bible. What, at first glance, what do you think the story of Babel is about? You can shout this out, or you can stick it in the chat, whatever feels right to you.
The development of languages.
I'm sorry?
Okay, we associate the city of Babel with the development of languages. Absolutely. We know that they were all speaking one language. God scatters them, and now we speak all kinds of different languages. So definitely it's an etiology of why we speak different languages. What else do you associate with Babel?
Pride of the people causing sin.
Okay, there's something about the pride of the people. It says that, verse beginning there, it says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. That's what Mena pointed out. And they migrated east and came upon the plain of Shinar and settled there. And they said, come, wait a minute, after bricks. It's come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered. Okay, so it looks like there's some pride there. They want to reach the heavens and make a name for themselves. Do you remember who else wanted to make a name for themselves? Or who else was doing that?
Was that the Nephilim or somebody else from like a few chapters ago that you just talked about, but I forgot?
That's okay, I took my screen share away. Yeah, you remember the Nephilim were warriors of great renown. The great renown there, the more literal translation is they made a name for themselves. So what you're seeing there is this kind of linguistic connection in the J narratives between people who are of great renown, who make a name for themselves, and people who are cultural innovators, right? The cursed sons, Cain's cursed great-grandsons, make things like metal tools, and they settle in single cities like the city of Enoch. We get from that sort of cursed line these warriors of great renown who make a name for themselves. We get from Ham, Nimrod, who is this builder of cities, and these will become these imperial cities. All of these urban dwellers are threats to the nomadic way of life, right? All of them reduce the amount of grazing land available. They build up standing armies, all kinds of things about urban life. Once you sort of shift to that kind of agriculture, all of those things become threats to nomadic ways of life. I think sometimes we sort of imagine, at least I think I did growing up, that the way history unfolds is linear, and that everybody kind of at the same time shifted toward going from being a hunter-gatherer to being a pastoral nomadic society with herds, and then went from that to being agriculturalists, settled in one places, and then went from that to building bigger and bigger cities. But history doesn't unfold in a linear way. In fact, some bands of people are at one stage while others are at another. And there's nothing to say that those stages have to go in that particular order. So the Philistines, for instance, have iron tools, while the Israelites are still in the Bronze Age. And there may well have been someone in that region who was still in the Stone Age at the same time. And so what we're seeing is this non-linear unfolding of history means that groups who have moved into a more settled stage of development represent an active threat to those who prefer to stay in a different stage. And I don't want to say an earlier stage because it's not a natural evolution. There's nothing that says you have to go from one to another. So we've got these people who are cursed, people like Ham, people like Canaan, people like Cain, none of whom are associated with the lineage that leads to Israel. And all of them are doing things that are culturally innovative, that lead to settling, and that are more agricultural in nature. And all of those things are threats to the nomadic style of life that would have been associated with Abraham and his lineage. The irony, of course, is that all of this is being written by the descendants of Abraham, who are themselves, by the time this is written down, living in cities. So there's kind of a lament about what has happened to us. Now, take a look at Babel just a little more carefully. So here where we were in verse 3. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. There's something kind of interesting about that bit of information. The narrator stops, or the narrator's telling the story. They said to each other, "Let's make bricks and build things." And then the narrator stops and looks at the audience and says, "They had brick for stone and mortar for bitumen." Okay, what's the narrator kind of showing a hand there, telling us something about the narrator's context?
It's pointing out that this was an oral tradition this is taken from.
I'm sorry?
He was speaking to people and they were responding to him.
Okay, so part of it is telling you that there's this oral tradition, right? That probably these stories were originally told to an audience, and the narrator can interrupt the narrative and say that, and the text still bears that mark. All right, it also tells you something else.
It seems adjacent to the whole story about building stuff in Egypt where they were making bricks, but also you use bricks when you don't have stone.
You use bricks when you don't have stone. Yeah. And so the narrator is telling us something about the technology of their own context. What do you think the narrator builds with?
Stone.
Hmm?
Stone.
Yeah, the narrator probably builds with stone. It would be like if I said, so they decided to write down their story and they took up their parchment and their quill. In those days, they didn't have ballpoint pens and paper, right? So the narrator is saying, we build with stones, but they didn't have stones, so they were building with bricks. And they were using the brick the way we use stone. So we just learned something kind of interesting there about the technology. But it's also true that stone is naturally occurring, right? You can just go out into a field and gather up all the stones that you have to remove in order to till the soil, and you can use those stones to build stuff. But this is a group that decided to make its own stones, right? That's a kind of cultural innovation. If I don't have stones to work with, that doesn't limit me in my building capacity. I'll just make stones of my own. I'll do that with brick. Okay, so we're seeing that, like the sons of Cain, these are innovators. These are people who create technologies. They create their own mortar. They create their own stones. So they're building. Let us build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Now, we have been so trained by tradition to read that and say, oh, you see what's happening here. This is an expression of pride. They're trying to topple God. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So we've sort of been trained to say that was pridefulness and God had to scatter their pride. But there's another way of reading it. Why exactly does God say that they have to that this is not a good idea.
Well, God says that nothing is going to be impossible for them, which means they'll be godlike.
Nothing will be impossible for them. They'll be godlike. In what respect? In what respect will they be like God?
Knowledge.
Knowledge. They're one people. They have one language. This is only the beginning of what they'll do. Nothing they propose will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other's speech. Who is threatened by a big culture with a single language? Like, for whom is that a threat? I know it says God is threatened by that, but let's.
Anybody else?
Yeah. What if you don't want to be assimilated into the megaculture? What if you don't want to speak English? What if you don't want to drive on the right side of the road? What if you don't want? Think about all the things that are part of a powerful culture and the way that powerful culture has the effect of assimilating, suppressing, and eventually wiping out any competing cultures. Think about the competing cultures present on the North American landmass at the turn of the 17th century. Right? Think about you've got the conquistadors in the southeast. You've got the indigenous populations, not population, populations. Lots of different cultures, lots of different languages. You've got settlers from England in New England, right? As the New England settlers become the dominant force, English becomes the singular language. Assumptions about how roads are built, where cities are located, how we conduct ourselves in public spaces, what's appropriate dress, all of those things begin to wipe out cultural difference. And so if you're a nomad in a context of settlers, you're going to get greater population density. You're likely to get a population explosion when you have settlers. You have a more reliable source of calories and so forth. And the result might be that one culture will come to dominate all of the other cultures in a region. Nomads are threatened by urban cultures, right? Anytime you get that kind of powerful monoculture, the competitor cultures are threatened by that. And so what God does is make sure that there'll be diversity. What God does is make sure that they'll be in different places and they'll speak different languages. It's not just a question of, are you speaking English or Spanish or French? All of those things aren't just using different words. You get immersed in a whole different culture. And so when the Babylonians have this one language, this central city, this central governing organization, what they're really doing is presenting a threat to all of the other cultures in the area. And you're reading this from the perspective of the culture that was threatened by those imperial cities, right? The Yahwistic author is thinking, I'm the descendant of the nomads who got wiped out by urban culture, right? My culture disappeared, my language disappeared, my practices disappeared. The only thing that is keeping the people associated with the Yahwistic narratives kind of organized culturally is that they have a very distinctive pattern of worship. And so what Mark McIntyre in Not Scattered or Confused is proposing is that if you pull the flood narrative out and read Genesis through this lens, that the Yahwistic narrative is taking us through a series of people who are cursed. And all of those people who are cursed are urbanists. And they're all making a name for themselves. They're all trying to leave their stamp on the earth. For the most part, nomads don't build great monuments, right? Nomads don't build pyramids. They don't build temples. Although I recently learned that there are some evidence of ancient nomads who did build a temple. So I'll put that in footnote for a minute. Nomads don't leave a mark on the land in the same way that agriculturalists and urbanists do. And so Mark McIntyre is proposing that what you're getting in J is this kind of retrospective question about being the descendant of people whose way of life was threatened and ultimately wiped out by these urbanists. And that's going to set up this central conflict that we're going to see throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible and even into the New Testament. And so that's what we'll be looking at over the course of the coming 5 weeks. I just looked at my clock and realized I've kept you over. I apologize for that. But that's a little taste of what we will be experimenting with in the next 5 weeks. And again, remember, this is Mark McIntyre's thesis. And I think it'll be good for us to pause at a few moments and evaluate. What do you think? Does this make sense or not? And then, of course, what does that got to do with us? Thank you, everyone.
Could you hold the book up a little longer?
Yes, I can.
Kendra, thank you. Thank you so much.
I typed the name of the book in the chat in case you can see it there.
Okay.
Also, if this is a little bit of a distraction, but if you prefer your agricultural versus pastoralist conflict in musical theater form, the musical Oklahoma has a sort of one of the strands through that is the farmer and the cowman, and there's a little song. And as a graduate, no, but as a graduate of high school and college in Oklahoma, I am obligated to mention that.
Very good. Kendra, I want to correct you on something. You called yourself a hack. I think we all disagree with that extremely strongly. And I want to quote our beloved Steve Montgomery, who often said that you were the best religion teacher, bar none, that he had ever heard. And we're very grateful for your being here with us again and on through September. And I trust we're all going to get better and more comfortable doing Zoom conversation than as we move along as well. So go in peace, go from Zoom to live stream.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
All right, and I will end the meeting.